A reluctant millionaire takes care of a pair of twins abandoned by their mother. A few months later, he has to go to the mother's house and give her a large sum of money to... The rain blurred the windows of the hospital lobby, streaks of water cascading under the harsh fluorescent light. Charles Wright adjusted his coat, shaking droplets from the hem as he approached the reception desk. He didn't care for hospitals, too sterile, too cold. But his assistant had insisted on this checkup. Routine, they'd called it, though Charles had never been fond of routines. As he handed his ID to the receptionist, a soft collision jolted him back. "Oh, I'm so sorry." A woman's voice, brittle and faint, cracked through the ambient hum of the lobby. Charles turned, frowning slightly. The woman was petite, with damp, matted hair clinging to her pale face. Her clothes were wrinkled and mismatched, as though chosen in haste, and, in each hand, she clutched a small child. The twins, no older than 3, huddled close to her legs, their wide eyes darting around nervously. "It's fine," Charles said, stepping aside instinctively. "Thank you," she mumbled, her hands trembling as she smoothed her jacket. "It's just a lot today." Her gaze briefly met his, a fleeting glance that seemed to carry years of weariness. She offered a shaky smile, then looked down at the girls. One of the twins, the braver of the two, peeked out from behind her mother's leg. "Mama, I'm cold," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman pulled her closer. "I know, sweetheart. Just a little longer." She turned back to Charles, as if realizing her intrusion. "I'm sorry again. It's just difficult finding help." Charles hesitated. "Do you need assistance?" The words felt foreign coming out of his mouth, but there was something about the woman's fragility that held him there. No, we're fine." She forced another smile, but didn't move. Her hands tightened around the children's shoulders, and her next words came out rushed, almost rehearsed. "Actually, would you mind watching them for a moment? Just while I run to the restroom?" Charles blinked, taken aback. They'll stay right here. I won't be long, I promise," she added hastily, her pleading eyes darting between him and the twins. He looked down at the girls, who looked back at him with a startled expression. Before he could formulate a response, the woman offered a hurried, "Thank you," released the children, and disappeared down the hallway. Minutes passed. The girls shuffled awkwardly, their tiny feet tapping against the tiled floor. Charles shifted his weight, uncomfortable under their watchful gazes. "What's your name?" the braver twin asked, her voice more curious now. "Charles," he replied, glancing toward the hallway. "And you?" "I'm Nancy," she said, her small hand pointing at herself before gesturing to her sister. "And that's Amy. She doesn't talk much." Amy looked down, clutching the hem of her oversized sweater. "Do you like lollipops?" Nancy continued, tilting her head. Charles frowned, unsure how to answer such a question. "I suppose." "Why?" Nancy shrugged. "Mama says people who like lollipops are nice." "Well," Charles said, straightening his coat, "I don't dislike them." Nancy seemed satisfied with his answer, though her expression soon turned thoughtful. "Where's Mama?" "She'll be back soon," Charles said, though his own confidence in that answer was waning. When 15 minutes stretched into 20, Charles approached the reception desk again, irritation creeping into his otherwise calm demeanor. "The woman with the 2 children," he said, gesturing toward the twins. "Could you make an announcement? She seems to have gone missing." The receptionist's brow furrowed. "Missing?" "Yes. She said she needed the restroom but hasn't returned," Charles explained tersely. The receptionist nodded, picking up the microphone. A tinny voice echoed through the lobby. "If anyone has seen a woman accompanied by 2 small children." No one responded. By the time an hour passed, Charles was certain the woman wasn't coming back. Nancy had climbed onto one of the waiting chairs, swinging her legs idly, while Amy leaned against her sister, eyelids drooping. "What now?" Nancy asked, looking up at Charles. He sighed, his carefully maintained patience fraying. "I'm going to leave my information here. If your mother returns, they'll call me." Nancy frowned. "What if she doesn't come back?" Charles didn't answer immediately. He could feel the weight of the question pressing on him. "Let's avoid assuming the worst," he finally said. Still, as he escorted the twins to his car, their small hands clinging to his larger one, an uneasy knot formed in his chest. Something about the encounter felt wrong, more than just a mother's temporary absence. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Charles pulled out of the hospital parking lot, the twins bundled in blankets in the back seat. As he drove, his thoughts churned with questions. Who was this woman? What kind of mother would leave her children with a stranger? And why, despite everything, did he feel compelled to keep them safe? The Wright estate loomed against the dull evening sky, its towering windows glowing faintly. Rainwater trickled from the iron gates as Charles eased his car into the long driveway. Behind him, Nancy and Amy sat in silence, their small faces pressed against the windows. The quiet was heavier than the storm outside. The twins huddled together as Charles opened the car door. "Come on," he said, keeping his tone neutral, unsure of how to sound reassuring. The girls slid out hesitantly, their steps cautious on the slick pavement. Nancy clutched Amy's hand, her tiny shoulders squared as if ready for another uncertain encounter. Inside, the house greeted them with an unsettling stillness. High ceilings stretched above polished floors, and faint echoes trailed their footsteps. It was a place meant for grandeur, not for children. Nancy stopped just past the threshold, her wide eyes scanning the ornate chandeliers and sharp-edged furniture. "Big," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Charles, already unbuttoning his coat, glanced over his shoulder. "This way," he instructed, leading them to the living room. He gestured toward a leather couch that looked too pristine to sit on. "You can rest here for a moment." The girls hesitated. Nancy edged closer to the couch, gently nudging Amy forward. The younger girl climbed up, curling into herself like a small animal seeking warmth. Nancy followed, her hand resting protectively on her sister's shoulder. Charles rubbed the back of his neck. He'd had board meetings that felt less awkward. "Are you hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Nancy nodded, though her eyes never left the room's unfamiliar corners. Amy didn't respond. Charles made his way to the kitchen, pausing to pull a blanket from a linen closet on his way. He unfolded it as he returned, the fabric whispering against his hands. "Here," he said, draping it over the girls. They flinched at first, but settled quickly, sinking into its warmth. He stopped, realizing he had no idea what to offer. "I'll see what I have." The kitchen, though state-of-the-art, was an intimidating maze of equipment Charles rarely used. He opened the refrigerator, scanning its contents with growing unease. Wine bottles, an expensive cheese platter, a lonely carton of eggs. He grabbed a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter from the pantry, their simplicity a small comfort. He hadn't made a sandwich in years, but it seemed straightforward enough. By the time he placed 2 unevenly spread sandwiches on plates, a trickle of satisfaction crept in. It wasn't gourmet, but it would do. When he returned, the girls were huddled closer, their voices low and indistinct. He placed the plates on the coffee table. "It's not much, but..." He trailed off, watching as Nancy cautiously took a plate. She handed the other to Amy, who peered at it suspiciously. "Thank you," Nancy murmured, her words barely audible. Charles sank into an armchair, the leather creaking beneath him. He observed the twins as they ate in silence. Nancy's bites were small, deliberate. Amy nibbled at the edges of her sandwich, her eyes darting toward him every so often. Their fragility was almost unbearable. "Do you have a favorite story?" Charles asked suddenly, surprising himself as much as them. Nancy paused mid-bite. "Stories?" "Yes," Charles said, leaning forward slightly. "Books, fairy tales, anything like that." Nancy exchanged a glance with Amy, then shrugged. "Mama used to tell us stories about princesses and dragons." Charles nodded, though his knowledge of children's stories was limited at best. "I'll see what I have." Later that night, after settling the girls in a guest room, Charles stood by the fireplace in the study, staring into the flames. The house, usually so quiet it felt like an extension of his own solitude, now carried the faint sounds of children, whispers, the soft creak of footsteps upstairs. It was strange, unsettling, and yet something about it felt right. He glanced at the couch where Nancy and Amy had been earlier. The blanket lay folded neatly, a small but deliberate gesture that struck him deeply. It was impossible not to notice the way their small frames seemed dwarfed by the vastness of his home. For all its elegance, the house was a hollow space, and now it felt like the twins' presence had filled something he hadn't realized was missing. Charles exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring. The logistics alone, schooling, clothes, their mother's absence, were overwhelming. But he couldn't ignore the pull he felt, the sense that his life had shifted irreversibly the moment Brenda disappeared. "Two strangers," he muttered under his breath. "What am I doing?" The flames crackled in reply, casting flickering shadows across the room. Charles remained where he was, staring into the fire as though it might hold the answers. Above him, the faint sound of giggles drifted down the staircase, breaking the silence. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Wright estate, casting muted shadows across the living room. Charles sat at the dining table, sipping his coffee and scanning the morning paper, though his thoughts were far from the headlines. Upstairs, he could hear the faint patter of small feet, accompanied by soft giggles, a sound that had grown strangely familiar over the past few months. The doorbell echoed through the house, just as he was starting to feel the pull of routine. Charles glanced up, frowning. Visitors were rare at this hour. He stood, folding the newspaper neatly, and moved toward the door. When he opened it, the sight before him made him pause. Brenda stood there, her hair disheveled and damp, clutching the strap of a worn satchel slung over her shoulder. Her eyes, wide and red-rimmed, darted between Charles and the ground. She looked thinner than he remembered, her face etched with lines of exhaustion. "Charles," she croaked, her voice trembling. "Please, I didn't know where else to go." His first instinct was anger, sharp and immediate, but something in her expression, a raw desperation, tempered his response. He stepped aside silently, gesturing for her to come in. Brenda hesitated, then shuffled into the foyer. Her gaze swept across the room briefly, before settling on Charles. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching her satchel tighter. "Where have you been?" His voice was steady, but carried an edge. He crossed his arms, watching her carefully. She looked down, her fingers fumbling with the strap. "It's a long story," she murmured. I didn't mean to leave them like that. I had no choice." "No choice?" Charles's tone sharpened. "You abandoned your daughters with a stranger and vanished for 5 months. Do you have any idea—" "I had debts," she interrupted, her voice cracking. She glanced up, and for the first time, Charles noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes. People. Dangerous people. They were after me. If I stayed, they would have hurt all of us. I thought they'd be safer with you." His jaw tightened. He wanted to press further, to demand answers, but the tremor in her voice held him back. "And now?" he asked, his voice softer. "Why are you here now?" Brenda's eyes glistened, and she looked away. "I couldn't stay away from them. I thought I could manage, but—" Her words faltered, and she wiped at her face roughly. "Please, Charles. I need to see them. I need to be with them." Upstairs, as if summoned by instinct, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Nancy's voice called out, "Uncle Charles?" Brenda's head whipped toward the staircase. Her entire posture shifted, stiffening and softening at once. Before Charles could respond, Nancy and Amy appeared at the top of the stairs, their matching pajamas rumpled from sleep. The moment Nancy spotted Brenda, her expression froze. "Mama," she whispered, gripping the banister tightly. Amy, still rubbing her eyes, blinked and stepped closer to her sister. Brenda inhaled sharply, her lips trembling. "Yes, sweetheart. It's me." Nancy didn't move at first, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But then, slowly, she descended the stairs, her movements hesitant. Amy followed, clutching the hem of Nancy's shirt. When the girls reached the bottom, Brenda dropped to her knees, opening her arms. "Come here," she pleaded, her voice breaking. The girls hesitated, exchanging a glance. Then, cautiously, Nancy stepped forward, and Amy followed suit. They fell into Brenda's arms, their small bodies fitting perfectly against her, as though no time had passed. Charles watched the scene in silence, his emotions a tangled mess. He turned away, letting them have their moment, and walked back into the living room. Later, after the initial reunion quieted, Brenda sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Charles leaned against the fireplace mantel, arms crossed. The warmth of the fire behind him felt misplaced, almost mocking the tension in the room. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Charles began. "What you did was reckless, irresponsible." Brenda flinched but didn't argue. "But," he continued, exhaling heavily, "they've grown attached to this place. To me." His voice softened slightly, as though the admission cost him something. "I won't take that away from them. If you're staying, we'll need to set boundaries." Her head snapped up, surprise flickering across her face. "Staying?" Charles nodded reluctantly. "They deserve stability, Brenda. I can't let them lose that again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'll do anything. I can work, clean, whatever you need." He regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, he said, "Fine. I'll arrange something at the office. You can start there." Her shoulders sagged in relief, but Charles caught the faintest flicker in her eyes. Something too quick and subtle to place. As Brenda murmured another thanks, Charles turned his gaze to the fire. The warmth no longer seemed comforting. There was something in Brenda's story that didn't sit right, and he intended to find out what it was. Wright Industries had always been a fortress of precision and control. Charles had built his empire on structure, trusting only a select few to oversee the intricate web of projects that kept the company thriving. However, in recent times, the weaknesses in that foundation became too evident to overlook. "Mr. Wright, can I have a moment?" Charles looked up from his desk to see Henry, his longtime chief of operations, standing in the doorway. The man's face was tight with concern, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Come in," Charles said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Henry sat, but didn't relax. He placed a folder on the desk between them. "We've had another issue, the Lindemann proposal, Confidential details were somehow leaked to their competitors before our pitch. They secured the contract before we could even present. Charles's fingers drummed against the edge of the desk. How? Henry shook his head. We're still investigating, but this is the third incident in as many weeks. First, it was the financial audits going missing. Then, the server breach in R&D. And now this. He hesitated. I'm sorry to say this, but it feels like someone on the inside. The word lingered in the air. Charles's jaw tightened. Have the IT team run another sweep. Restrict access to sensitive documents for the time being. And keep this quiet, Henry. I don't want speculation running wild. Understood. Henry nodded, though his expression remained uneasy. As the door clicked shut behind him, Charles leaned back in his chair, his mind already turning over the implications. Sabotage. It wasn't impossible. Wright Industries had enemies, of course. But an insider. That was a betrayal he hadn't anticipated. The following days did little to ease his concerns. Brenda, now employed as part of the cleaning staff, moved through the offices with an unassuming air. She carried supplies from room to room, her head down, her demeanor meek. If anyone noticed her lingering too long near a desk or computer, they didn't comment. But Charles had begun to notice. One evening, as he worked late in his office, the faint sound of footsteps caught his attention. He glanced at the clock, well past regular hours. Rising, he moved silently to the door and cracked it open. Down the hallway, Brenda stood in the dim light, her figure silhouetted against the glass panels of a meeting room. She was bent over a desk, her fingers hovering near a file. For a moment she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, then quickly withdrew her hand and adjusted a trash bin, as if that had been her intention all along. Charles watched her leave without confronting her, the unease in his chest growing heavier. The next morning, a memo arrived on Charles's desk. Another project setback, this time involving confidential blueprints for a renewable energy initiative. They'd been leaked to a competitor whose own announcement had gone public just hours earlier. Henry stormed into the office shortly after. Charles, this situation is becoming increasingly uncontrollable. Whoever's doing this is one step ahead of us at every turn. Charles' tone was measured, but his words carried weight. I've already started looking into it. Quietly. Henry frowned. What are you thinking? Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Just focus on locking down security. I'll handle the rest. At home, the tension of work began to bleed into Charles's private life. Nancy and Amy had grown more comfortable in the estate, their laughter filling spaces that had long been silent. They now called him Uncle Charles, their bond with him deepening in ways he hadn't anticipated. At the dinner table, Nancy chattered about a book Charles had brought home for them. Amy, ever the quieter of the two, nodded along, her small face lighting up as her sister spoke. Uncle Charles, Nancy asked suddenly, tilting her head, is Mama happy at your office? He was surprised by the question. Why do you ask? She's always so serious when she comes home, Nancy said, frowning. And she says you're very busy. Charles forced a small smile. Work can be serious sometimes, but I'll make sure your Mama has everything she needs to be happy. Nancy seemed satisfied with the answer, but Charles couldn't shake the weight of her words. That evening, he sat in his study, the fireplace crackling faintly as the girls' giggles floated down from the floor above. His thoughts were a tangle of doubt and suspicion. He thought back to Brenda's story, her desperate pleas, the tears she'd shed at his doorstep. It had been convincing. Too convincing, perhaps. He reached for his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in years. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed. Edgar, he said when the line connected. I need your help. Discreetly. There's something or someone, I need you to look into." The crackle of the fire seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed, its flickering shadows playing across Charles's face. For the first time, he wondered if he'd brought more than just two frightened children into his home, and if the trust he'd extended was a mistake he couldn't afford. The private investigator Edgar was as unassuming as they came. Graying hair, a plain suit, and an old leather satchel slung over his shoulder. But Charles trusted him. Edgar had proven his discretion and skill on more than one occasion. "Brenda Simmons," Charles said, sliding a photo across his desk. "I need everything. Where she's been, who she's connected to, and whether her story holds up." Edgar studied the photo for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing. "The woman you mentioned on the call. A house cleaner now, right?" Charles nodded. "She claims she had debts, dangerous ones, that forced her to abandon her daughters. But something doesn't add up." Edgar slipped the photo into his satchel. "I'll dig around. Give me a week." True to his word, Edgar returned a week later, his expression heavier than usual. He placed a manila folder on Charles's desk, but didn't immediately open it. "Start from the beginning," Charles prompted, leaning forward. Edgar sighed, pulling out a few documents. "First off, her story about the debts? Completely fabricated. I found no evidence, no loan sharks, no criminal ties, nothing. Brenda Simmons has no financial record of owing anyone anything substantial." Charles's brow furrowed. "Then why lie about it?" "To gain your sympathy, maybe. But it gets stranger." Edgar slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Brenda in the company of a man, tall, dark-haired, with a sharp jawline and an expression that radiated cold calculation. "Bradley Davis," Edgar explained. "I've been trailing her, and this man keeps showing up. They've met 3 times in the past month, always in out-of-the-way places. Restaurants, a park on the edge of the city. He's careful, but not careful enough." "Who is he?" Charles asked, studying the man in the photo. "That's where it gets murky," Edgar admitted. "Davis has ties to some questionable dealings, small-time fraud, smuggling operations. Nothing that screams mastermind, but enough to make him dangerous. And enough to make me think he's connected to whatever's going on at your company." Charles's grip tightened on the photograph. "You think Brenda is working with him?" "Can't say for sure," Edgar replied. "But she's hiding something, and whatever it is, Davis is a part of it." Parallel to Edgar's investigation, Brenda's unease had become increasingly evident. She moved through the office halls with her usual humble demeanor, but Charles noticed the subtle changes. She glanced over her shoulder more often. Her hands fidgeted when she thought no one was watching. Late one afternoon, as Charles was reviewing reports, he caught sight of her lingering near an office that should have been locked. She carried a trash bin, but her eyes darted to a computer screen left active on a desk. She hesitated, her hand hovering near the keyboard, before stepping back quickly when footsteps approached. Charles observed her from a distance, his chest tightening. The Brenda who had begged for stability at his doorstep appeared completely different from the one he now saw. At home, the tension crept in like a shadow. Nancy and Amy, oblivious to the complexities swirling around them, had embraced the estate as their home. They played in the garden, drew pictures at the kitchen table, and filled the once quiet halls with laughter. But even in those moments of levity, Charles couldn't shake the weight of Edgar's findings. Over dinner one evening, Nancy looked up from her plate and tilted her head. "Uncle Charles, why do you look so serious?" He blinked, startled by the observation. "Just thinking about work," he said with a faint smile. Nancy nodded solemnly. "Mama says you work too much. She says you're very busy." Amy, ever the quieter one, tugged at Nancy's sleeve and whispered something. Nancy giggled. "She also says you're a little grumpy." Despite himself, Charles chuckled softly. "Does she now?" Nancy grinned, but her expression turned thoughtful. "She's been quiet, too. Is she okay?" Charles paused, his fork hovering over his plate. "She's adjusting," he said carefully. "We all are." The answer seemed to satisfy Nancy, but Charles felt the knot in his chest tighten further. A few days later, Edgar returned to the estate, his demeanor even more somber than before. "What is it?" Charles asked, gesturing for him to sit. Edgar placed another folder on the desk. "Davis isn't just some random associate. He's connected." Charles leaned forward. "Connected how?" Edgar hesitated, his fingers drumming against the folder. "I've started digging into Davis's background, but it's complicated. Let's just say there's more to this than I initially thought. I need more time to confirm everything." Charles's jaw tightened. "What aren't you telling me, Edgar?" The investigator met his gaze evenly. "I think Davis's involvement might be tied to your family. Indirectly, maybe. But it's there." The words hit Charles like a blow, and for a moment he could only stare at the folder. "Keep digging," he said finally, his voice low. "I want to know everything." Edgar nodded, standing to leave. As the door closed behind him, Charles leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. Brenda's lies, the mysterious Bradley Davis, the cracks forming within his company. Everything felt like pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. And the picture they were forming was far more personal than he had anticipated. The rain was relentless, a steady rhythm against the windows of Charles's study. He stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames as Edgar's latest words echoed in his mind. "Tied to your family. Indirectly." The weight of it pressed against his chest, an unwelcome anchor pulling him further into a sea of unanswered questions. The knock at the door startled him. Edgar entered, his usual unflappable demeanor carrying an edge of discomfort. In his hand was another folder, thicker than the last. "Charles," he began, placing the folder on the desk. "I've pieced together enough. You should sit down for this." Charles's jaw tightened, but he obliged, lowering himself into the chair. "Tell me," he said, his voice clipped. Edgar opened the folder, revealing photos, documents, and a birth certificate. He slid one of the photos across the desk. Bradley Davis stared back at Charles, the same sharp features from the earlier picture now layered with something else: familiarity. "This is your half-brother," Edgar said plainly, cutting through the silence. Charles froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "What?" "Bradley Davis," Edgar continued. "Born out of wedlock, to a woman named Eleanor Davis. Your father, Albert Wright, had an affair with her for several years. Bradley was the result." Charles's fingers curled against the edge of the desk. "You're certain?" Edgar nodded, sliding the birth certificate forward. "Albert's name is on the record. Bradley grew up knowing exactly who his father was, but never received the acknowledgement or support he craved. Eleanor passed away when he was young, and he bounced between relatives after that." The room seemed to shrink around Charles. He felt the weight of the family portrait on the wall behind him, a stark reminder of the pristine, controlled image Albert had cultivated. And now he's... what? Holding a grudge? "It's deeper than that," Edgar said, his voice calm but firm. Bradley's life was hard. Without financial or emotional support, he struggled. Meanwhile, he saw you, a legitimate son, living a life of privilege. He blames you as much as your father. In his eyes, you represent everything he was denied. Charles stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside him. "And Brenda? How does she fit into all of this?" "She's his wife," Edgar said, dropping another revelation. "They married 7 years ago. Bradley's been feeding her the same narrative, that your family's success came at their expense, that you and your father ruined their lives. Charles turned, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. And she believed him? Edgar nodded. It's clear she's been manipulated, but that doesn't absolve her. She's been working with Bradley to gather information to sabotage your company. They're playing the long game, Charles. As Edgar laid out the details, fragments of the past began to align in Charles's mind. Flashbacks of his father's stern lectures and secretive behavior surfaced. Albert Wright had always been a man of control, but this... Charles clenched his fists. His father's legacy was unraveling before him, exposing truths he never wanted to confront. Later that night, Charles sat alone in the study. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. He stared at the photo of Bradley, trying to reconcile the man before him with the brother he never knew existed. The anger was there, hot and sharp, but it was tempered by something deeper. Guilt. Had he been blind to this? Had Albert's actions created a ripple that had now reached him? Brenda's role added another layer of complexity. He had taken her into his home, trusted her, however cautiously. Her betrayal stung, but the picture Edgar painted of her life with Bradley was not one of ease. Charles exhaled, the weight in his chest pressing harder. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Charles called Edgar. "What's your advice?" he asked without preamble. "Approach Brenda carefully," Edgar said. Edgar cautioned that confronting Brenda directly could force her further into Bradley's sphere of influence. Albert Wright had always been a man of control, but this... Charles clenched his fists. His father's legacy was unraveling before him, exposing truths he never wanted to confront. Later that night, Charles sat alone in the study. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. He stared at the photo of Bradley, trying to reconcile the man before him with the brother he never knew existed. The anger was there, hot and sharp, but it was tempered by something deeper. Guilt. Had he been blind to this? Had Albert's actions created a ripple that had now reached him? Brenda's role added another layer of complexity. He had taken her into his home, trusted her, however cautiously. Her betrayal stung, but the picture Edgar painted of her life with Bradley was not one of ease. Charles exhaled, the weight in his chest pressing harder. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Charles called Edgar. "What's your advice?" he asked without preamble. "Approach Brenda carefully," Edgar said. Edgar cautioned that confronting Brenda directly could force her further into Bradley's sphere of influence. The storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. And this time, it was personal. The tension in the air was palpable as Charles entered the sitting room where Brenda waited, her hands folded tightly in her lap. As he closed the door behind him, Brenda looked up, her eyes darting nervously, akin to a trapped animal. For a long moment, he said nothing, pacing the room with his arms folded, his silence heavier than any words. "I know everything," he said finally, his voice low but cutting. Brenda flinched. "Charles, He raised a hand to stop her. "Don't. Not yet. I've given you every opportunity to prove me wrong, to show me that you were more than the lies you fed me. However, at every stage, your actions have only reinforced my deepest doubts." Her lips parted, but no sound came. "You used them," Charles continued, his tone sharper now. "Nancy and Amy. You knew I wouldn't turn away from them. You played on my pity, on my guilt, and you used that to worm your way into my company, into my life." Tears welled in Brenda's eyes, but Charles's expression remained cold. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he pressed, his voice rising slightly. "The sabotage, the leaks, everything you've been doing with Bradley has put hundreds of people's livelihoods at risk. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Stop! Brenda's voice broke through, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. Charles scoffed, crossing his arms. You didn't have a choice. You manipulated me, Brenda. You betrayed every ounce of trust I gave you. Don't tell me you didn't have a choice. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't want to do this, she whispered, her voice muffled. But Bradley, he wouldn't let it go. He said you deserved it. Charles froze, his fists clenching at the mention of Bradley's name. Deserved what? For what my father did? For mistakes that weren't mine to begin with? Brenda looked up, her face streaked with tears. He told me your family destroyed his life, that you ignored him, cast him aside while you lived in luxury. He made me believe it was all your fault. Charles took a deep breath, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. And you believed him. You believed that I was responsible for his pain. For your pain. Her silence was answer enough. I didn't even know he existed, Charles said, his voice softening slightly. Do you think I wouldn't have done something if I had known? Do you think I wanted this? Any of this? Brenda's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from her. I didn't know what to think, she admitted. I was scared. Bradley, he's persuasive. He made me feel like I had no choice. You always had a choice, Charles said firmly, stepping closer. You chose to use your daughters, Brenda. You involved them in this mess, and that's something I can't forgive. At his words, Brenda broke down completely, her sobs shaking her small frame. I didn't mean to hurt them. I thought... She paused, choking on her words. I thought I was protecting them. I didn't know it would go this far. Charles watched her, his expression unreadable. You may have thought you were doing the right thing, he said finally, his voice calmer. But that doesn't absolve you. You let your fear dictate your actions, and now you've dragged everyone into this, including 2 innocent children. Brenda nodded weakly, her tears slowing. I know, she whispered. I know I've made mistakes. But please, Charles, don't punish them for what I've done. He sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. Nancy and Amy deserve better than this, better than lies and manipulation. They deserve stability, Brenda, and I'll make sure they have it, even if it means stepping away. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. What do you mean? You're leaving, Charles said bluntly. Take them. Go. I'll arrange for financial support. But I can't have you here anymore. I can't let this cycle of deceit continue. Brenda's lips trembled, but she didn't argue. She stood slowly, wiping her eyes with trembling hands. I'll pack their things. Charles nodded curtly, watching as she left the room, her steps unsteady. An hour later, Brenda and the girls stood by the front door. Nancy clung to her mother's hand, her eyes wide with confusion. Amy held a small stuffed rabbit, her grip tight. Uncle Charles, Nancy asked, her voice small. Are we coming back? Charles knelt to her level, his heart aching at the innocence in her gaze. Not for now, he said gently. But I'll make sure you're safe, always. Nancy's brow furrowed, but she nodded solemnly. Brenda met Charles's gaze one last time, her expression a mixture of regret and gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. Charles didn't respond, simply closing the door behind them as they stepped out into the rain. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty hallway, the echoes of their departure lingering in the air. As the storm raged outside, Charles returned to the study. The fire had long since died out, leaving only embers. He sat in the quiet, his thoughts heavy, wondering if he could ever untangle himself from the web of resentment his family had spun. The house, once filled with laughter, now felt unbearably empty. The city lights shimmered faintly as Charles's car pulled up to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The rain had eased into a light drizzle, the damp pavement glistening under the glow of street lamps. He hesitated for a moment, gripping the leather steering wheel, before stepping out. The house before him was small but tidy, its shutters freshly painted and its porch adorned with potted plants. Brenda's new beginning, perhaps. As he approached the door, the sound of laughter filtered through the thin walls. Nancy and Amy. It was a sound he hadn't heard in weeks, and it stirred something deep within him, an ache he hadn't yet reconciled. The door opened for he could knock. Brenda stood there, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. She glanced behind him as if expecting someone else. "Charles," she said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" He straightened, his coat still damp from the drizzle. "I came to see the girls," he said simply. "And to talk." Brenda hesitated, then stepped aside. The interior was humble, with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of freshly baked bread. Nancy and Amy sat on a worn rug, engrossed in a board game. When they noticed him, their faces lit up. "Uncle Charles!" Nancy exclaimed, scrambling to her feet and running to him. Amy followed, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. Charles crouched, catching them both in a hug. For a brief moment, the tension in the room seemed to melt away. "Uncle Charles," Nancy began, her voice filled with curiosity, "why haven't you come to visit us sooner?" He hesitated, glancing at Brenda, who stood silently by the doorway. "I've been busy," he said finally, his tone softer than usual. "But I'm here now." Amy tugged at his sleeve, her small voice piping up. "Are you staying for dinner?" Before he could answer, Brenda interjected. "Girls, why don't you go finish your game? I need to talk to Uncle Charles for a moment." Nancy pouted but nodded, leading Amy back to the rug. In the kitchen, Brenda busied herself with wiping the counter, though her movements were stiff. Charles leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You've made this place." "Nice," he offered. Brenda nodded, not meeting his gaze. "It's not much, but it's enough for us." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out an envelope. "This should help," he said, placing it on the counter. Brenda froze, her hand hovering over the cloth she held. "What is this?" "Enough to cover whatever you need. Rent, school for the girls, anything." She finally looked at him, her eyes brimming with conflicting emotions. "Why?" Charles exhaled, the weight of the past weeks pressing against him. "Because no matter what's happened, Nancy and Amy deserve the best, and because I made mistakes too." Brenda's grip tightened on the cloth. "Mistakes?" he nodded. "I didn't know about Bradley. I didn't know the pain my father caused, the resentment it left behind. However, this does not imply that I was innocent. I overlooked numerous issues, Brenda. For that, I'm sorry." Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, her mask of defiance cracked. "I believed him," she said quietly. "I believed every word Bradley said about you and your family. I thought I was fighting for justice, for him. But all I did was hurt the people I care about." Charles stepped closer, his voice steady but gentle. "It's not too late to fix things. For you. For them." He nodded toward the living room, where Nancy and Amy's laughter echoed softly. Brenda turned away, wiping her eyes quickly. "I don't know how to fix this, Charles. Bradley. He doesn't stop. He doesn't let go." A shadow passed over Charles's face. "He'll have to," he said firmly. "This ends now." Unbeknownst to them, a figure lingered just outside the kitchen door. Bradley, his face pale and taut, had arrived moments earlier. He'd planned to confront Brenda about her growing distance, but instead had overheard their conversation. Charles's words echoed in his mind as he stood in the shadows. "I'm sorry." The phrase gnawed at him, unraveling the anger and bitterness he'd carried for years. For so long, he had convinced himself that Charles was the villain in his story, the embodiment of everything he had been denied. But now, hearing those words, spoken with sincerity, not obligation, shook something loose within him. "I'll keep my promise," Charles continued, unaware of Bradley's presence. "Nancy and Amy will always have a place in my life, no matter what. But you have to decide, Brenda. Do you keep looking back, or do you start moving forward?" Brenda didn't respond immediately, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Finally, she nodded. "I'll move forward," she whispered. "For them." Charles's expression softened and he stepped back. "Good." As he turned to leave, Bradley slipped out of sight, retreating to the shadows of the porch. Charles didn't notice him as he walked to his car, but Brenda did. Her gaze lingered on the silhouette as the door creaked shut, her breath hitching. Bradley remained outside long after Charles's car disappeared down the street. For the first time in years, the anger that had driven him felt hollow. The house behind him, the laughter of his nieces, the man who had apologized for sins not his own. It all weighed heavily on him. He stared into the darkened street, his fists unclenching for the first time in what felt like forever. The night was still as Bradley stood on the porch, the weight of Charles's words pressing into his chest. The sound of Nancy and Amy's laughter carried through the walls behind him, warm and genuine. For years, he'd fueled himself with resentment, believing it was his right to feel anger. Toward Charles, toward Albert Wright, toward the life he never had. But now, the bitterness felt like an overwhelming burden. He walked home in silence, his hands deep in his coat pockets. Brenda's small house, its warmth and imperfections, replayed in his mind. Charles's voice echoed, "Do you keep looking back, or do you start moving forward?" The question lingered, more an accusation than a challenge, and Bradley hated how it clawed at him. Back in his apartment, the stark contrast of his life to Brenda's hit him. The sparse furnishings, the empty bottles on the counter, and the silence. It all felt suffocating now. He sat heavily on the worn couch, staring at the floor. The memories came unbidden. Eleanor, his mother, working late shifts to make ends meet while Albert Wright's name appeared in every newspaper. Smiling, shaking hands with politicians, a perfect family by his side. The bitterness of being ignored, cast aside, while his half-brother Charles lived in luxury, had shaped every decision Bradley made. But had it all been worth it? His thoughts turned to Brenda, her weary face, the tears she'd shed in their rare moments of honesty, the tension that had grown between them as his anger consumed them both. And then Nancy and Amy. How he dragged them into a mess they couldn't understand. What kind of man had he become? The next morning, Bradley walked into the kitchen of Brenda's house unannounced. She jumped at his presence, her eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" "I want to talk," Bradley said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Brenda crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "Now you want to talk, after everything you've put us through?" "I know," he said, holding up a hand. "You're right. I've been an idiot, worse than that." He paused, struggling with the words. "I didn't see it before, but I do now. I've let my anger control everything. Us, the girls. I've used you, just like I accused Charles of using his family. And I'm sorry." Brenda's arms dropped slightly, her expression softening. "What's changed?" Bradley exhaled, looking around the modest kitchen. "Charles came to see you, didn't he? I overheard what he said. And for the first time I realized he wasn't the man I thought he was. Maybe he never was. But me? I've been worse than I ever thought he could be. Brenda stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. So what now, Bradley? You apologize and we're supposed to forgive and forget? No, Bradley admitted, his voice firm but quiet. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I want to make things right. For you. For Nancy and Amy. In the weeks that followed, Bradley began to change in ways Brenda had never thought possible. He found a small storefront on the edge of town and poured the money Charles had left into turning it into a flower shop. Brenda, hesitant at first, eventually joined him, finding solace in the quiet, methodical work of arranging blooms. Nancy and Amy helped too, their giggles filling the shop as they placed petals and ribbons in careful patterns. For the first time in years, their family felt like it was building something instead of tearing itself apart. One afternoon, Bradley stood behind the counter, watching Brenda teach Nancy how to tie a bow around a bouquet. Amy was in the corner, drawing pictures of flowers and smiling to herself. The scene felt peaceful. "You've done well here," Brenda said suddenly, breaking his reverie. He looked at her, surprised. "I didn't think you could change," she admitted. "But maybe I was wrong." Bradley's throat tightened. He nodded, his voice steady. "I'm trying. For them. For us." That evening, after closing the shop, Bradley sat on the porch with Brenda as the girls played in the yard. The air was cool but pleasant, the sky painted with the soft hues of sunset. "You should tell him," Brenda said, breaking the silence. "Tell who what?" "Charles," she said, meeting his gaze. "You should tell him you're sorry. Properly." Bradley looked down at his hands, the weight of her words settling over him. "You think he'd even listen?" Brenda smiled faintly. "He listened to me, and I think he's waiting for you to stop looking back." Bradley nodded slowly, the words sinking in. For the first time he thought maybe, just maybe, she was right. The anger that had driven him for so long had lost its edge, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild. And for the first time in his life, Bradley Davis felt free. The flower shop smelled of fresh blooms, a delicate blend of roses, lilies, and lavender. Bradley stood behind the counter, wrapping a bouquet of soft pink carnations with trembling hands. It wasn't much, but it carried the weight of something far greater than an apology. Each petal seemed to whisper a plea. "I'm ready to face the truth." Brenda watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed, but her expression softer than usual. "Are you sure about this?" Bradley nodded, his voice low. "I have to." He adjusted the ribbon around the bouquet one last time before slipping on his coat and stepping into the cool morning air. The walk to Charles's estate was quiet, the streets still waking up under the gentle light of dawn. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Bradley pressed on, his grip tightening on the bouquet. The Wright estate was as imposing as ever, its towering gates and manicured lawns a stark reminder of everything Bradley had resented. But this time, he saw it differently. The grandeur no longer mocked him. It simply existed, as neutral as the sky above. The butler answered the door, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Mr. Davis?" "I'm here to see Charles," Bradley said, his voice steadier than he expected. The butler hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here." Minutes later, Charles appeared at the doorway, dressed casually, but with his usual composed demeanor. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Bradley holding the bouquet, but he masked his surprise quickly. "Bradley," Charles said, his tone neutral, "this is unexpected." "I need to talk to you," Bradley replied. He hesitated, then extended the bouquet. "And this is for you, a peace offering." Charles blinked, glancing at the flowers before taking them slowly. A peace offering? Bradley shifted uncomfortably. I know it doesn't fix anything, but it's a start. Charles studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. The two brothers sat in the study, the fire crackling softly between them. Bradley's eyes wandered over the bookshelves and polished wood, a space so different from his own humble surroundings. Charles set the bouquet on the table and leaned back in his chair. Why are you here, Bradley? Bradley took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. To say I'm sorry. For everything. Charles raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. I've spent my whole life blaming you, Bradley continued, his voice heavy with emotion. Blaming you for what our father did, or didn't do, for the life I didn't have. But the truth is, you didn't deserve any of it. The anger, the sabotage, the lies, that was all on me. Charles's expression softened, but he remained silent, letting Bradley speak. I thought if I could hurt you, I'd feel better, Bradley admitted, his voice breaking. But it didn't fix anything. It just made everything worse. For me, for Brenda, for the girls. And then I heard what you said to her. About how you didn't know. About how you were sorry, even though you didn't owe me anything. He looked up, his eyes glistening. That's when I realized how wrong I'd been. You're not the villain in my story, Charles. I was. The room fell silent, the weight of Bradley's words hanging between them. Charles leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. I didn't know about you, Bradley. If I had, things might have been different. But I can't change the past, and neither can you. What matters is what we do now. Bradley nodded, swallowing hard. I want to move forward. I want to build something for my family. And I want to let go of the anger. Charles studied him for a moment, then stood. He walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Our father wasn't perfect, he said finally. He made mistakes. Mistakes that hurt you. Hurt all of us in different ways. But I won't let those mistakes define us. Turning back to Bradley, Charles added, You're a part of this family, whether you like it or not, and the right family will always have room for you. And for Brenda, Nancy, and Amy. Bradley's breath hitched, and he looked away, wiping at his eyes. Thank you, he said quietly. Charles approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. This isn't just about forgiveness, Bradley. It's about rebuilding. And I think we can do that together. As Bradley left the estate, the bouquet still in Charles's study, he paused at the gate. He turned back, watching the grand house with new eyes. For years it had symbolized everything he hated. Now it felt like a bridge, a connection he never thought he'd have. Charles stood in the doorway, watching him leave. Their eyes met briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. As Charles stepped back inside, Bradley lingered, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. For the first time in years, he let the tears fall. Not out of anger, but out of relief. The walls he'd built around himself, walls of resentment, bitterness, and pain, were finally crumbling. And in their place, something new was beginning to grow. The Wright estate brimmed with a warm, lively energy that it hadn't known in years. The long dining table was set with care, the fine china glinting softly under the golden light of the chandelier. The aroma of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and hearty stew wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of laughter. Nancy and Amy raced through the wide hallways, their giggles echoing as they chased each other, their small feet pattering against the polished wood floors. Charles watched them from the doorway of the dining room, a faint smile playing on his lips. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like a home. Brenda entered the room carrying a large bowl of salad, her movements confident but understated. She gave Charles a brief, genuine smile, a gesture that conveyed the peace they had finally found. Bradley followed her, holding a tray of glasses. His demeanor was quieter, but the tension that had once defined him seemed to have melted away. "Uncle Charles!" Nancy called, skidding to a halt in front of him. She grabbed his hand, tugging him toward the table. "Come sit. We're starving." Amy nodded eagerly, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "You promised to sit next to me." Charles chuckled and allowed them to guide him to his seat. The table filled quickly, the once empty chairs now occupied by a family pieced together through pain, forgiveness, and love. Bradley took his place at the far end opposite Charles. The brothers exchanged a glance, quiet, understanding, and full of unspoken gratitude. Dinner was lively, the room filled with the hum of conversation and the clatter of silverware. Nancy and Amy recounted their adventures in the flower shop, their stories punctuated by giggles and dramatic hand gestures. Brenda added details, her voice light with amusement, as she gently teased her daughters. Even Bradley chimed in, his usually reserved tone carrying a warmth that surprised everyone. Charles leaned back, letting their voices wash over him. He'd spent so many years chasing perfection, maintaining control, that he'd forgotten what this felt like, messy, unpredictable, and achingly human. At one point, Nancy stood on her chair, holding up a drawing she had made. "Look, Uncle Charles, it's you and us in the garden." Charles leaned forward, examining the colorful scribbles of stick figures surrounded by flowers. His heart swelled as he noticed the detail Nancy had included, him holding Amy's hand, while Nancy stood proudly by his side. "It's wonderful," he said sincerely, ruffling her hair. "We'll have to frame it." Nancy beamed, sitting down with a satisfied nod. Amy reached over, tugging at Charles's sleeve. "Do you think we can plant a real garden here?" Charles nodded. "Of course. We'll start next weekend. You can pick whatever flowers you want." Amy's eyes lit up, and she turned to her mother. "Did you hear that, Mama? Uncle Charles said we can plant a garden." Brenda smiled, her eyes glistening slightly. "I heard, sweetheart. It sounds wonderful." After dinner, they moved to the living room, where the girls sprawled out on the carpet with their coloring books. Charles and Bradley sat by the fireplace, each holding a glass of wine. The conversation started slow, cautious, but as the minutes passed, the barriers between them began to dissolve. "Charles," Bradley said finally, his voice steady but earnest, "I need to say it again. Thank you. For everything. For giving us a chance." Charles swirled the wine in his glass, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You earned it, Bradley. You chose to let go of the past. That wasn't easy, I know." Bradley nodded, his jaw tightening. "I spent so long blaming you for everything, but now I see it wasn't your fault. None of this was. We were both ensnared in the same tempest, albeit through distinct methods." Charles turned to him, his expression softening. "Our father left a mess behind, but we don't have to keep living in it. You're my brother, Bradley. That's all that matters now." The words hung in the air, and Bradley looked down, his hand tightening around the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "I never thought I'd hear you say that." Charles reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Well, get used to it." Bradley let out a shaky laugh, wiping at his eyes quickly. "You Wrights sure know how to mess with a man's emotions." Charles smirked. "It's a gift." As the evening wound down, Brenda gathered Nancy and Amy, who were fighting to keep their eyes open. The girls clung to Charles, their goodnight hugs lingering. "Uncle Charles," Nancy murmured sleepily. "Can we come back soon?" "Always," Charles said, his voice firm. "This is your home too." Amy yawned, nodding in agreement as Brenda led them toward the door. Bradley stayed behind for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room. The walls that had once seemed cold and imposing now felt warm and welcoming. "Thank you," Bradley said again, his voice low. "Our father left a mess behind, but we don't have to keep living in it. You're my brother, Bradley. That's all that matters now." The words hung in the air, and Bradley looked down, his hand tightening around the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "I never thought I'd hear you say that." Charles reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Well, get used to it." Bradley let out a shaky laugh, wiping at his eyes quickly. "You Wrights sure know how to mess with a man's emotions." Charles smirked. "It's a gift." As the evening wound down, Brenda gathered Nancy and Amy, who were fighting to keep their eyes open. The girls clung to Charles, their goodnight hugs lingering. "Uncle Charles," Nancy murmured sleepily, "can we come back soon?" "Always," Charles said, his voice firm. "This is your home too." Amy yawned, nodding in agreement as Brenda led them toward the door. Bradley stayed behind for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room. The walls that had once seemed cold and imposing now felt warm and welcoming. "Thank you," Bradley said again, his voice low. "If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.